Welcome to Mindful Madness. I'm Christina, and we are doing a live Mad Reads book club. We're going over women's work, the first 20,000 years, by Elizabeth Wayland Barber. This is episode 2, and we went through. Let me switch this over just really quick here. We went through. With Wayland Barber. Okay, so episode 1, we did book intro, Finding the Invisible, The String Revolution, Courtyard Sisterhood, Bronze Age Shift. And then in this episode, we are going to do The Language of Clothes, The Code, Birth of Slavery, and The State and Linen, and how things kind of echo today. Last time we did go through, and you can kind of see down below here, I'm leaving this up because it kind of lets us know like where we're at in the flow of things as far as time periods go. So, and I went over this in more detail, so I'm going to be a little bit lighter with it this go around. But this little guide, as a reminder, just kind of lets us know like time periods and what they were called, the things that were going on. So like if we look at the Mesolithic, the Middle Stone Age, that was about 10,000 to about 8,000 BCE. And this kind of varies by region and exposures to other cultures and this sort of thing. There were smaller stone tools during that period of time. There were fishing technologies. There were things like nets and this sort of thing. So cordage was in place, and we kind of talk about cordage being one of the first technologies created by men, by humans, and how that kind of came into play. And then we have taken it through, and we're kind of kicking around. We went through the Paleolithic, the Mesolithic, the Neolithic, getting into the Stone Age, Copper Age. We're kind of kicking around a bit more into the Bronze Age. At this point, we were hanging around Greece and kind of talking about how during this period of time, women are really in control of this technology. They're the ones that have been doing it. They're the ones that developed it. They have handed it down from generation to generation. They have used it. It's a community builder. It is a social fabric, literally. That this is the first aspects of past stories beyond just the word of mouth. So we have stories, mythologies. We have ceremonial aspects that are woven into the actual cloth through dyes, through different weave types, this sort of thing. And at this point in time, we have stratified the social network. So we have hierarchy. People, for the most part, have settled down. Agriculture. We've domesticated animals by this point. And we are seeing empires rising and falling. And this sort of thing is going on. So now we're starting to get into Uh, we're going to talk about a little bit about the language of clothes. And then we're going to talk about how this starts to transition into something that we are going to recognize today. So, this super interesting, super interesting. So, it's more than hearts on our sleeves. So, hearts go way back. We've been putting hearts on things for a long time. And that adage, he or she wears her heart on her sleeve, literally, this is part of a practice that was passed down. As a matter of fact, different colors displayed different things in clothing. So as dyes developed, different types of dyes, um, those sorts of things became symbols of not just hierarchy, but also like ceremonial worship aspects. Some colors were only for certain ranks. There, they could be protectors. There were some cloths that could take an entire year to create that might be used for a goddess, for a special event. There could be cloths that were created for protection. A wife or a hopeful might design a cloth to protect somebody that's going out into battle or traveling, this sort of thing. Red was commonly used in some cultures around clothing openings like sleeves, collars. Red would be worn around these areas to ward off little demons or spirits from entering in and making the person ill. So there's a few different things. Early on, you can also see through the frescoes and the pottery and this sort of thing that women dressed very nicely because they were the ones that were in control of the linen production. Any extras that their household made, they would take that and they would have their family member or husband, when they went to market, they would take these linens to market and sell. And then they would either bring, sometimes a combo, more materials, different types of materials, to create different types of cloth. Or they might bring back dyes or just the funds. So, and we have written letters back and forth describing these things. Counts, this sort of thing, are in the written record during this period of time. So, so during this time, clothes made the man, but women made the clothes. The Bronze Age of dress styles are still seen today. So when you go through the book, I did the audio version, but if you go through and kind of look and see like tunics, we see these things still being worn today. Tunics were shortened into shirts later on, especially when when we started riding horses. Tunics became shorter, or they were split more. So certain adjustments, but you can still see the original way that these styles were created, how some of those have changed a little bit, but they're still with us. Aprons are another aspect of that. We didn't actually get into pants for quite a while, including for men. So interesting little things in there. Let's see. So clothing as a language. Most clothes were worn for social reasons. We do have evidence that tattoos have been found around the Iron Age. showing that this was likely not a new art. It looked like it was fairly well advanced. Temporary stamp art on cloth, skin, and containers were seen during this period of time, and that's the Iron Age. So Iron Age, about 1200, or excuse me, yeah, about 1200 to about 500 BCE. Iron tools and weapons, expanding empires, expanding agriculture, and this was also the advent of classical antiquity. Let's see. By this point, we also have permanent dyes and the use of silks and wools in advanced textiles. Colors became huge during this period of time. And we also start seeing some things become more gender specific, especially for ceremonial sort of things. Tunics became common, and we still see similar today in shirts and dresses. Tunics were worn by women first, and then men, and then later shortened. And we kind of talked about it before, but subtle clothing changes can be traced similar to language. And we've talked about that a little bit. We definitely did in the last video. Let's see. So signals, so clothing signals status, gender status, whether or not you were marrying age, were already married, this sort of thing could be defined by the type of clothing that you wore. We still see that today. Rank, group identity, wealth, material status, and political alignments. And we still see that stuff today, right? Different aspects, but yes. Pants were created about 1000 BCE with the advent of horseback riding. Horseback riding also made it possible for larger herding. So that was advantageous, and then it was horses were also one of the first advances in military weaponry. So if you had the ability to ride a horse into battle, it gave you basically an upper hand. Chinese were forced to start riding horses because there were others that were already riding, and they're basically getting their butts handed to them. And the nomads kept coming in and stealing their silks and their food. And so the Chinese got together, bribed them with silks and food if they would just stop killing them. There is record that the nomads took them up on that offer. The Chinese learned how to ride their horses, and the story goes on. So, as today, textiles were portable political messaging in many different ways. So being able to gift textiles as gifts was one of those ways, not just the status of it or the design of it or the color of it, but in the giving of it as well. As things developed and people were taken with agriculture and with this ability to store and acquire more than needed to survive, that hierarchical or stratospheric stratization of society, then we started seeing if you had a good sized family and the women of the house produced more than the family needed, or they wanted to bring other items into the house or acquire other items for the house, that they would work beyond what they needed and then trade with those goods. As the stratification of society became more prominent, and then they started using uh, other people as workers, and extorting their labor for their gains. So this started to happen during this period of time, especially when you have empires that are taking over other empires. There's conflict going on. People are being kidnapped. This sort of thing. Um, forced labor became a thing. So also the diversification and the magnification of the markets, local markets, and further reaching markets, also exacerbated the use of forced labor, um, extorted labor. Let's see. So now we're getting into controlling narrative, controlling clothing, and controlling identity markers, controlling people, controlling wealth. This sort of thing is starting to come into play. So, elements of the code. So, as society is developing, knowing your place and then dressing accordingly became a thing, and it only got stronger over the years. It is not I it is not as blunt today. I think we're all pretty aware. England went through periods of time where if you dressed higher than your station, you could be killed, or severely punished for dressing outside of your station, higher than your station. So a shift in pattern. Patterns are equal to meaning. So status, married, crowns, marking the body. Today we have bumper stickers, brands, this sort of thing. Then they had family crests, flags, that sort of thing. So things have changed, but then things have really not changed. So information story recording, nonverbal communications, and so we still do that today. So military, whether or not maid, office worker, different types of clothes for different things that we're working on. Let's see. Borders, color, pavement, repetition, and weave complexity were all aspects of doing the textiles. We talked about. Okay. During certain areas and certain periods of time, some of the color designations that they would share. We talked about red. Yellow was often for women. Red was a sign of vitality. The roses were for protection. Birds and eggs were for fertility. And this was a type of woven magic. So it held a meaning, a purpose, an expectation, a hope. And also reflected cycles of birth and death in these fabrics. Let's see. So these weren't just decorative flourishes, they were readable systems. So, so it's it's important to really understand, and I went over this in more detail in episode 1. Um, women, and we talked about grandmothers, the purpose of grandmothers, how there are just like 3 or 4 species on the planet where the females are taken off production, and specifically hold the later part of their lives, specifically because they are passing on vital information for survival, to their offspring, their community. That's not done with men. It was only done and developed through women. So the grandmother is there to help uh, their offspring and grandchildren, to thrive and to understand and have the knowledge to be able to move their community forward. So, and with that, women were the holders of knowledge, and what plants to use, what not to use, what had medicinal value, how you did specific crafts, um, the starting, and even like the young boys would learn textile, with within the bee. And we kind of talked about that in more detail in section 1, where it was a community thing. The men would come in, they'd work their leather goods, create tools, this sort of thing. And the whole community worked together, working on those things that they needed to survive and thrive. Okay. So women encoded social information in fiber long before there was written alphabets were being used widespread. It was it was the first means beyond just the spoken word to pass information along. Let's see. And we get into, okay, so we're moving things around. So men traveled to markets for trade. They did bulk agriculture, and they tended large animals. Women made textiles for trade, tended smaller animals, did milk, cheese production. Northern Europe and Africa, not Asia, did not develop. So Asian cultures didn't use milk products, so they didn't create the enzymes in their systems to digest that. So Northern Europe and African cultures did, so they have the enzymes to actually digest milk, which is an interesting adaptation over time. Let's see. Women also would grind the grain. So everybody in agriculture, everybody had something that they did. So if you weren't planting and weeding, that sort of thing, sowing, harvesting, drying, chafing, extracting, everybody pitched in. Let's see. The Bronze Age brings slavery. The hierarchy now exists. Rich exploit the slaves and the poor. This shifts. Domestic labor becomes industrial infrastructure. So luxury and common goods trade. So luxury and common good trades increase during this period of time, and taxation begins. Lovely. So, and that's the Bronze Age. So Bronze Age, 3300 to 1200 BCE. Bronze tools and weapons, urban civilizations, empires, writing systems, and long distance trade are all in play during this period of time. Let's see. In early uh, in early Near Eastern cities, men traded metals and the wives' textiles. We talked about that. Women would trade in the markets as well. So women would go to market, um, and they would trade for other women's textiles. So maybe you like the weave or their pattern or whatever it is. Ladies, we know. They like something, let's trade it, let's do something, right? Textile production becomes organized. So what was once a community thing is now has an extraction element to it. So and we get into this. So if women are in control of textiles at this point, and we're starting to have more of an industrial infrastructure to this. When slaves are brought into the city, or however they're acquired, the women could own these people. So women could own property, slaves, metals, textiles, tools, looms. These were her business things. And if she brought those into a marriage, she held higher value to the new family. Um, in a divorce, the man could drown her if she left. If he left, he would need to pay her. So if he left, he paid her. If she left, he drowned her. Seems consistent, doesn't it? Ridiculous. Okay. Workshops appear. Overseers, both men and women. So men were paid more, and women were paid less. So like just jump straight into it, right? But we also know that the hierarchies, how they're structured, um, it's the start of patriarchy, and yeah, and everything that goes with it, and it follows us to this day in most cultures. Patriarchy spread like a disease, and it's not one we've been able to get rid of, because it definitely doesn't benefit the majority of the people that are under it. That extraction factor for men, women, and society as a whole, because patriarchy ultimately is a tool used by the elite for extraction purposes. I think most of us here are very clear on that at this point. If not, you will be. Okay, let's see. Okay, labor specialization increases. So household textiles plus market textiles and special occasions become more defined. Cloth becomes a major trade commodity. And we also know through historical records, queens also did textiles. They had luxe threads that they worked with. They also worked with weaving in gold and silver into their textiles. Some of their tools were made of gold and silver. Some of these tools were also gifted to guests from other areas. Also, businesses, looms, and servants. Men also did some of the work in the textile industrialization. So, and textile slaves were definitely valued higher than other slaves, especially if they had higher skill sets. Um, Royalty gave garments as gifts, and also if you clothed your servants well, it was kind of it was seen as a bragging point. If your servants were dressed well, it meant you were doing really good. Women's labor scales with urbanization. Um, so during this time around the Mediterranean, women were doctors, priestesses, they were scribes, they were fully integrated into the society. They were literally part of the fabric of society. Okay. The land of linen. So Egypt was the land of linen. Egypt in particular did not like wool because wool was heavy. It didn't breathe. It had issues with it because of the arid temperatures, the dryness, this sort of thing. Linen was better, airy, flowy, light. For all of those reasons, Egypt was the land of linen, and linen was wealth. Linens used to be white. Today, they're mostly worn black. So most of the Middle East, we do see like the dark black clothing that covers them basically from head to foot in most instances. But back when, it used to be light colored white. Wool, they considered wool dirty. Linen was considered clean, cooler, and shed dirt and dust easier where wool gathered it. Linen is made from flax, which is a plant. It's really cool how that's actually done. Look it up on YouTube, and it'll go through and it'll show you what the plant looks like, the grasses, how they beat it, they dry it, they break the outer layer, and then you can see the fibers in it, and then how those fibers are then start to become twisted into the linen threads. Amazing. It's really an interesting process. I never really put much thought into it until I read this book, and now I've watched several videos, and it's really very relaxing. I definitely have a new appreciation for that art form and how it developed over the ages. Let's see. Men worked the plants and harvested and made ropes. And then the finer parts of the plants were given to the women for the textiles. So there, and when you go through and you watch the videos, there definitely is a rougher section of the plant. And then I believe it's like up towards the tassel, the threads are finer. And so those finer threads are what they will use for the finest linen cloths. Some of them can be rough depending on what part of the stalk that they're accessing, and then again how it's beat, dried, that sort of thing. Okay, so so then we have this transition from where this used to be a community building thing that was done in the home or in the community or village as a group. Now it's becoming industrialized. The state has taken over the system. So state systems absorb women's work. So now it has a counted value to it, monetary value to it for trade at this point. And in the Middle Kingdom of Egypt, 2150 to about 1800 BCE, had been mostly it had mostly been a secluded civilization. So large scale textile production was mostly done by women. Men mostly worked outside. Women were weavers, gardeners, nurses, musicians, ladies of the house, townswomen, grinders, servants, priestesses, and cooks were the majority of the areas that spaces that the women filled. Palace and temple involvement and organized labor systems. Men did the laundry, boiling, or men did the laundry. So they were either boiling the laundry or they were down by the river with the crocodiles. And men did mat weaving. So like the little floor mats and that sort of thing. Men were given the task of doing that sort of weaving. And then the state begins to formalize what had been decentralized labor. So, and you will start hearing more about decentralization. It is something where whenever we can decentralize something, it makes us less reliant on state industries that can be used basically against you as an extraction tool. And you'll hear more about this as you go through and read the books and really start to get an overall picture of how this stuff is used now to control populations, much to society's detriment, for sure. Okay, so now we were getting into bureaucracies. Bureaucracy attaches to invisible labor. So from the very get, using other people's, extorting labor from other people, not giving them the value for what they produced has been an issue from the get. The whole thing is based on extraction. So, and understanding that, and anytime they don't have to pay for something, but they get something because it's been taken, that is part of invisible labor. And so when we think about invisible women, the first book in the series that we read, this adds another layer onto that. Because this behavior has been here. It's the origination of the grift. Okay, so then we're going to talk about visible. Okay, we're getting close to our little break point in here. All right, so now we're going to kind of talk about the early Bronze Age silver and gold spindles for the elite. Queens did make textiles because it was an art, and it was a generational thing. It literally was the fabric of society. Like it was a fundamental aspect. So queens would have their own textile houses, their own slaves. They themselves would make specific things. We kind of talked about their special tools and their spindles and this sort of thing. Um, Elite economics rely on outsourced women's labor. So luxe quality materials others could not afford were used by elite women and their servants working their businesses, their gold beads, basically their own brand. So the Queen's brand of clothes. And we still see like elite style clothes to this day, right? So she gets into like the Greeks. She will kind of take points in the book where she will talk specifically about a region, kind of like how she spent a little bit of time over in Egypt, and how they were somewhat secluded for a period of time. And then as other societies grew into and started mingling with them, how some of that kind of changed for them. Um, let's see. So women would produce for palace systems. They were grinders, water carriers, textiles, nurses, serving women, priestesses, new captives, and part of the serfdom. Taking women was common. Women with the skill set of textiles were highly valued because you could extract their talent. Specialization of each task of textile production um, meant more of a production line, not like how community did it before. So now you're doing one specific thing over and over and over and over again. So the production line has started, right? So you're not seeing, as an artisan, you would see the product, the creation, the art from beginning to end. Now you're only doing a small portion of it. As a matter of fact, you can, what they have found in the bones of the people that worked these, they could determine pretty accurately through the wearing of the bones what tasks those people probably did most of their lives, because those same issues were found in other skeletal remains. Let's see. Textile quotas are at the point where they're now recorded. So remember, when we talk about invisible women and what is counted as part of GDP nationally, that's not all of the labor in the United States. That's just what certain elite aspects of our system choose to count. Right. So if they don't count it, somebody else absorbs it, but the work still gets done. So that's that passing the buck, right? Okay. So weavers were listed in administrative tablets. And I wrote really tiny. Okay, so weavers, okay, so once production of any item takes hold, the artisans no longer benefit from their own work, no longer wear fine textiles. The quality and artistry drop. Quantity, profit, cheap labor take over. Pottery, same thing. And so when we go through and we look at what has happened with the products that we buy, how I'm a Gen Xer, and I remember when we used to be as somebody that had purchasing power, that that you were serviced, you were a client, you were respected, you were um, you were not what you are now. So now we are an open piggy bank to be extracted from, and that we are a consumer. So now we are no longer clients, we're consumers. We consume and are consumed. So, but I thought it was very interesting. So once you take it out of the aspect of the community, the decentralized community that produces something through uncounted labor hours, and how that goes into production. And now, instead of going through and weaving a pattern in, taking the time to weave a pattern in, going through different dye processes, this sort of thing, now just simply stamping it is good enough, because now it is quantity over quality, and profit, and the cheaper you can do it, the better. And look at all the crap in our houses that falls apart constantly, right? And how the quality of things, like, and the very fact that we can't fix things. So, there's it's a constant degradation. More and more for less and less, less and less for more and more, right? Yeah. So we finally see women in writing as labor units. So visibility often comes through extraction. So, and we're going to pause here because it's really important to understand that common men, we might not be counted on the books. We are definitely extracted from, but the men are also extracted from. The only one that really gains from these hierarchical structures, these stratified structures, are really elite men. Women gain by dancing close to the flame, but they're generally the first to be burned. So, and we see that. We see that in, most recently, Marjorie Taylor Greene. She benefited as long as she went along with what they were feeding. But as soon as she was like, hold on a second, we have seen the results. So, so basically the same thing here. So men are extracted from, women are definitely extracted from. It is an extraction process. All right. Women created story cloths of family, people, deities, special events. When one was burned or otherwise lost, it erased history. There's a story of a gal that took a year to create a cloth with the story of her loved one. He somehow or another lost her good graces, and she burnt the cloth in his history. So, yeah, and these could take a year or more to create. So behind the myths, yes. Okay, so behind the myths, white cloth is the paper of housewives. They're story cloths, right? So they were the equivalent of the first paper created, and the stories that were woven into them. Oh, here's a good one. Interesting anyway. Um, Women would also use cloths to kill people. They would line them or soak them in poison. And when the wearer wore these over a period of time, it would slowly kill them. So, dragon's blood was something that used to be put on them. So, dragon's blood is a soft mineral. I might kill how this is actually pronounced. Relgar, and it's Realgar. Relgar is how I'm going to pronounce it. It was a red orange color. It contained arsenic. It was used in dyes. A garment dyed with this could kill someone in about a month of constant skin contact. And you have to think, you didn't really have a lot of garments and you would wear the same thing over and over and over again. And the ladies, being very aware and in tune to what plants do what minerals do what, health benefits and otherwise, would be pretty keen to catch on to something being afoot and probably where that was coming from and then use it accordingly. So, get rid of a bad husband, abusive husband, or maybe somebody that was somehow a challenge in their life or obstructing something that they wanted. You know, the typical stuff that humans do when they get kind of nasty about things. Spinning and weaving appear repeatedly in mythology. So fate has spun thread. Both are linear. Greek, the three hags. In the three hags, you have the spinner. So in the three hags, you have the maid, the woman, and the elder. So and the maid or the three hags, one of them is the spinner, one of them measures time, linear, and one of them is the shears. So elderly being the shears, the woman measuring time, and the maid being the spinner of the future, right? Goddesses as weavers. Aphrodite was a spinner. She was a creator. She was associated with lifespan, and lifespan is associated or equal to being a spinner. And spinner being the maid, spinner being the future, right? Athena was a weaver, protector of civilization, to weave a plan, right? Athena was also associated with an owl and the owl of wisdom, because remember, women carry information for future generations. They teach the future generations. So the owl of wisdom and Athena, the goddess Athena, had those talents associated with her. Textile metaphors for destiny. So Sleeping Beauty and the spindles, Rumpelstiltskin spinning straw to gold. So straw to gold. Straw has the element or looks like gold when it's spun. But it also is that transformation from plant matter into a gold or a value. Three spinsters. Grimm's Tales. You have Clubfoot, Fat Lip, and Big Thumb. And then you have the princesses. So the Clubfoot was from spinning. The Fat Lip was from licking the threads as they're being created or used. And the Big Thumb was from the pressing, um, in the weave and in the spinning of the threads. So just interesting how some of that, it's like you hear about it and then you just don't really associate like what are they actually talking about at the time that those nursery rhymes were put together. These were the things or the commonalities or the extractions that you could see around them, which created the story. And then the willies, when you get the willies, you know, like, ugh. The willies are the souls of girls who died without children. They have the power to give they're unused. So they have the power to give their unused fertility to crops, livestock, and families. However, the further north you go, the creepier they get. So in Ukraine, they were beautiful. Bird women, loose sleeves, and magical in nature. You get a little further north and, you hear about getting the willies and it's associated like with the hag or something not as nice. So, and the fact of it is they're not random images. They're cultural memory of who shaped continuity. And then let's see. I want to make sure I'm not going. Oh, you know what? Plain and fancy. Okay. We are going to stop right there. I did go over just a little bit in context, but that's okay. We'll go ahead and finish this up in episode 3. And in episode 3, we're going to go over plain or fancy, which just kind of talks about a little bit more quantity over quality. And then we're going to just kind of wrap up the book. There's a few other little tidbits in here that we'll kind of go through. Let me kind of look at this really quick here. Actually, we're just about done. Let's go ahead and do this. Take a pause if you need to. Yeah, let's go ahead and do this because it's just a short little section, and then there's just a couple little comments here. So really, just like maybe 5 to 10 more minutes. So plain or fancy. So men made textiles. Men basically started taking over the textile industry. It became industrialized, separate from the household. It became an industrial commodity. So they started doing the textiles, new materials, new cloth, new techniques, new tools, things that became more automated. And they had been the predominant traders, so they had access to the markets. And although women did participate in the markets, and some of them really continued to participate in the markets heavily, predominantly it became more of a man's space because they had been traveling the distances, they'd had the connections, they had the resources, and now they were starting to create faster, cheaper ways and or extorting from other people. Okay. So then we start getting into novelty trends and how novelty and trends begin to drive the behavior. Cash becomes a huge incentive prestige that goes along with it, and slave masters begin to profit in slave trade. New or tried and true, women made textiles, social, economic, religious. Um, their homes came first. The market was second. And then innovation isn't linear, it's responsive. So wealth accumulation, hierarchy, um, and having, so it becomes more about haves and have-nots. And it just has echoed through time to today. Um, and this was through late bronze and through the Iron Age. Industries show more experimentation, standardization, and market preference shifts. Egypt begins to push novelty trends, experimentation, production, imitation, cheaper, faster, looks similar, but not quite the same. And women were not static traditionalists. Evidence of the purchase of expensive looms, many looms. So if a woman owned a lot of looms, that was a business. So, because technically she'd only need 1 or 2 looms depending on the size of the fabrics that she's making, right? And she might have one that lays down and one that stands up, or she might have them of different sizes depending on what her talents and preferences were. Athenian women, unlike Egyptian women, lost their equality from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. They were forced to stay home and run the house. Elite women, when the house went broke, were considered worthless unless they produced something. Same thing during the US Civil War. Southern women had no skills to survive on their own. And we see that through the letters that they used to write. On the other side, poor women gathered and survived because they still had those elements of community cohesion, understanding, information, those things that helped families and societies survive over millennia. Lost to elite women who were removed from those information resources. So and you see those elements today. You do. Curious thing. So Spartan women did not spin or weave. They were as physical as the men and active in society. Ionians did spin and weave and remained open in society. As a matter of fact, the Athenians, when they lost their equality, and this is an important thing to understand, when women lose equality, they shrink in size. When there's equality, the women are similar in size to the men. Patriarchies have a tendency to really push for skinny, unathletic, puny, basically childish women. Yeah, I guess I'm going to go there. Adolescent in a lot of respects. They're not robust. They're not entirely healthy. They're gaunt. I show the more unequal the smaller the women are. And as a matter of fact, if you go through, and this is not part of the reading schedule that we have for Mad Reads, but I just got done reading a book that I slipped in with all of my other reading. I did do an audio on it. It's Goliath's Curse. And that book has been sitting in the back of my brain, just marinating. Wonderfully done book. But he goes into more detail about the heights of men and women, common people versus elite people during different periods of time in history. You take Goliath's Curse and lay it over the top of women's work the first 20,000 years. That is a combo that is impressive to overlay those two books together. It is the clarity that you gain in understanding that at the height of some of these empires, the common people were at their shortest because of the extortive practices. When the height of these empires fell, you would see the height of the common people after the fall increase because the wealth distribution. And the reason that they call, especially like the Dark Ages, it was the Dark Ages because the elites controlled education. They were the scribes. It takes an education to be a scribe or read, or do art, those sorts of things. So when their empire fell and you entered the Dark Ages, the common people's height increased, the size of their homes increased, their overall standard in living increased because they weren't being extorted the way that they were. And I used to think the height of these empires, well, that would be the best time to be in these empires. But it was only if you were one of the elite, one of the few. And it was Dark Ages because the common people, well, they didn't have access to education. They didn't have time to do that kind of art. They didn't write, they didn't read, and so that was why it was considered the Dark Ages. But it was the best time for the common people when the elite were gone, or otherwise not as powerful or as extractive. Amazing book. I do strongly recommend reading that one or listening to it. I listen to it on, sometimes I like to do the audiobooks and then I put them on like 1.5 or 2 times the speed. So I go through the content a little bit faster. That's just me. Okay. Almost done here. So let's see. Okay, so we talked about the Civil War and the elite women versus the poor women and who survived and who struggled. And okay, and then just some little closing notes on this. So just our ability to now just really think about what's recorded, why it's recorded, and how do we account for what's not being recorded? How do we account for those sort of things? How do we read archaeological gaps, texts, textiles, advancements of scientific tools, moving away from valuable metals and arts to the value in the small details and more of a scientific approach? How to reconstruct labor histories, how to treat silence as a clue that there might be something missing. This is methodological literacy. And it's core to what we do here. So, what works best for society, that deconstructing, decentralization, the big D's that make life so much better when we're not being extorted from. This book in particular, just as a closing note, this text anchors women, labor, and value because it shows women's labor precedes state systems. Women's labor scales with trade. Women's labor encodes culture. Women's labor becomes industrialized. Women's labor is absorbed into bureaucracy. Women's labor is recorded only when monetized. Women's labor disappears when devalued. This is a 20,000-year case study in infrastructure without credit, production without authorship, value without narrative ownership. This is not a nostalgia book. It's a systems primer. And what we can do differently as we move forward, reclaiming our spaces, reclaiming our value, our worth, and the space that we have always held, whether or not it's been valued or not. All dependent on who's counting it or who we let count it. Anywho, that's it. That closes that out. I will make some adjustments in this. So we actually only did 2 episodes, not 3 episodes. So I'll get all of that stuff updated. We are working, I am working on, let's see if I can drop a few things. I am working on the patriarchy, the origins of inequality. This has been a wonderful book. Another layer. Let me go over and show you guys, just as a reminder, to go over, let me do a little transition over here. So if you go over to Substack, you will find the little website over there. We're doing women, labor, and value, and what women sustain, produce, and are seldom credited for. And I am finishing up the patriarchs, the origins of inequality now. We've already read Invisible Women. You can go check out the videos there. We just finished up women's work, and then I'll be working on the Care Manifesto. And then I think what I'm probably going to do, so we have language, narrative, and manipulation. We got a few books in there. Understanding systems, history, memory, and erasure. Those are powerful books. Power, control, and extraction. Important. Building in parallel. That is the decentralization that is replacing failed systems or systems that simply no longer exist, and how we make those still function. Inner architecture. I think what I am going to do is I'm going to do the patriarchs, and then I'm going to do the Care Manifesto. And then I think it's going to be important that we jump into trauma and recovery. And it's trauma and recovery because we're at war with Iran, and we have increasing hostile militant groups wandering our streets, and a lot of these people that are in that group are simply not good people. And some of us will either be dealing with them firsthand, or we will probably begin knowing people that have dealt with them firsthand. And this is going to at least help us navigate some of those situations. And I'll put some warnings up. You know, this information, we take it as we're able. And we always want to make sure that we're keeping our mental health in a happy space, or at least at a point where we're functioning as well as we can. So I will put warnings up when we're getting into subject matter that maybe you need to take a break on or skip altogether. There's a few of these books that will get a little deep. And in some of those instances, what I might go through and do is do maybe two versions where I kind of do a lighter version that's really more about concepts, where using examples of instances might be too much for certain people. So I'll kind of think about how we structure that. Anywho, I do thank you for checking this out, and I look forward to seeing you next time. This is Mindful Madness with Mad Reads, and enjoy your day.